Okay, so we just finished talking about code tables. Now we're going to move on to basically a separate topic, which is metadata. So we'll see we've got our UML diagram that we've been working on so far, and we crossed some stuff out. We crossed off the code we dealt with. Now we're going to do this little is criminal information Boolean that's part of the charge. And that is interesting because it's not really data. It's data about data. It's not information about the crash driver. It's not even information about the charge. It's information about the charge, hence the term metadata. Well, let's try to clarify that a little bit more with a cat photo. So earlier, we mentioned a cat named Jet with an owner named Tom Carlson. And we use that to talk about referencing things like that. Well, this is Jet. This is the cat Jet. This is my cat. There is data about Jet, but there is also data about the data about Jet. So here's some examples. Data about Jet. Her name is Jet. She's named after Joan Jett, and she's jet black, so it's just a nice, clever name. She's a girl cat, a female cat, and she weighs exactly 8 pounds. I like to say she's 8 pounds of perfection. She's 8 pounds, but she weighs exactly 8 pounds. She's just perfect weight for a small cat her size. Weighs 8 pounds. This is all data about Jet. This is all about Jet. Jet's got a name, Jet has a sex, Jet has a weight. But then there is data about the data about Jet. For example, about her weight. Sure, she weighs 8 pounds, but where did we find that out? Who told us that? When did they tell us that? When was it verified? So, for example, the reporting organization, Godspeed Animal Care. That's just our local vet place, and they're right around the corner from us, and they're great folks. So that's where we go. Which organization reported that weight? Godspeed Animal Care. Who was the reporting person? Oh, that'd be Dr. Dudley, our vet, and she's awesome. She's wonderful. So she was the one who reported the weight. Again, that's data about the weight itself, not data about Jet. When was that information reported? Well, it was reported on June 10th of 2021. I was going to say last year, but I'm not sure when you're going to be watching this. So middle of 2021 was when it was first reported as 8 pounds. When was it last verified? It was last verified last December when she had her checkup. They weighed her. She was still 8 pounds of perfection. So these 4 chunks of information are not about Jet. They're about Jet's weight. This is data about the piece of data about Jet. That's what metadata is. It's information about information, data about data. And it typically takes the form of when was it reported, who reported it, when was it last verified, what's the accuracy of it, where did it come from, things like that. Again, though, this is information about the 8 pounds, the value 8 pounds, the weight of Jet. It's not information about Jet herself. The way we do this in NIEM is we have special objects to represent the metadata. And then objects to which that metadata applies have a pointer to the metadata object that applies to them. That's that metadata attribute we saw when we first talked about referencing. So our example is going to be metadata. It's going to be J metadata, the metadata in justice. It's going to be criminal information indicator. So how do we find that? Well, first let's look. What did we call it? We're just looking for criminal information. All right, we'll just go search for criminal information. So I've got them both up. Let's try in Wayfarer. Criminal inform, that's enough. Inform, that's enough. And we'll do the same thing in the SSGT. Again, perfectly fine to leave the ends off of words. And hey, criminal information indicator. Huh, that's perfect. That's just what we wanted. And in Wayfarer, same thing. We have a number of different ones, and the one that makes sense is the criminal information indicator. And if we see the definition for it, let's go back to the SSGT, see the definition. True if the information specified is classified as criminal information. False if it is not classified as criminal information. That's metadata. It's about another piece of information. It's not data in and of itself about a thing. It's information about the information about a thing. Let's see what it could be contained in. It could be contained in things of J metadata type. What kind of things are of J metadata type? Well, click on the type in SSGT, and we'll get a list of the properties, and it's the metadata object. So there's a J metadata object. Oh, that's cool. Let's go find more about that. Let's go back to the notes first and talk a little bit more about how we do metadata before we delve into this particular metadata piece. So I just said, just before we went off to do some searching, that objects point to the metadata that applies to them. That allows you to do several things. That allows you to, if you want, have the object point to just one piece of metadata. That's really simple. But if you want, you can have that object point to multiple pieces of metadata. That metadata attribute allows for multiple IDs in it. So I could have two separate metadata objects out there and have my object point to both of them. Because the objects point to the metadata, I could also have two separate objects pointing to the same piece of metadata. And because each object can point to multiple pieces of metadata, I can mix and match. I could have multiple objects pointing to multiple pieces of metadata. This is really, really powerful, but it can be difficult to implement. It can really be a problem to implement because it's a lot of referencing to keep track of. So before we look at the schemas, let's go back to the SSGT and have a look at what we have with the JMetadata. So here's our JMetadata. Now normally we've been opening these things in the search results, which is where I like to generally do it because it's easy. I search for it, I found it. But we're on the JMetadata page, so let's go ahead and open it up. And it just has two things, a criminal information indicator and an intelligence information indicator. That's cool. But there are other metadata blocks in NIEM as well. If we just search for metadata, we'll find a whole range of them. So here are all the different metadata objects in NIEM, and there's a whole bunch. One is generic, it's NIEM Core's metadata. So we can open that up and see things like an administrative ID, caveat text, comments, a confidence percentage, who created it, descriptions of it, distribution information, effectiveness dates, expiration dates, the language it's in, last updated dates, last verified dates. Notice that these are all information chunks about other information. They're all ways of qualifying an existing piece of information. If something that's applied to data to tell us about the data itself, not about the object that the data is part of. So these are all metadata chunks. NIEM Core has one, Justice has one, Human Services has one. Theirs has things like creation date. Turned out there wasn't a creation date in NIEM Core, so we put it in Human Services. Next major update, this will probably move into NIEM Core because this is a general purpose thing. But it was needed by Human Services, wasn't already there, and so we added it to this domain, and it'll move into NIEM Core at a major version change because that's when things move into NIEM Core. Protected health information, that's very much Human Services there. PHI, very important concept, and so that's in Human Services. If you want to be able to mark data as being PHI, this is the indicator to apply to them. CBRN breaks their metadata into topics. So there's case metadata, data file metadata, total dose metadata, CUI markings. Those are there as metadata. Justice has that's a metadata repository. So that's not a metadata piece, just has metadata in the name. But MilOps has a bunch. So there's just a lot of different metadata blocks in NIEM already predefined for you to use. What they look like in schema is actually pretty simple. They're just objects. They just happen to have the name metadata. So, for example, here is the JMetadata object, the one we were looking at with our criminal information indicator. So JMetadata type, metadata objects of JMetadata type. Here's one of those app infos. If you think way back to the layers diagram where we were looking at structures and everything works off of structures, well, this is an example of app info. This applies to types. This would tell us what kinds of things you could apply this metadata to. You could apply it to plain old objects, and you can apply it to associations. Cool. Do any tools use this information? I don't think any do, but it's there for them just in case they did. We scroll down a little bit, we see the definition for metadata type. And it's nothing special, it's just an object just like any other NIEM object, but we call it metadata. Here's metadata type. It's based off of a structure's metadata type. And what this does is what any of these kind of base structures do. It creates a container and it puts infrastructure metadata on. It's the same as the metadata for any other container, except for it doesn't actually include the metadata attribute itself, because you can't point a metadata block at a metadata block, then it would be a metadata, and we're not going to go down that road. So metadata blocks can have IDs, and then other objects can point to those metadata blocks. Here's the criminal information indicator that we're going to use. There's an intelligence information indicator as well. And that creates our metadata. That is our metadata object. Very simple. In the instance document, it's going to look like this. Here's our metadata object with the criminal indicator inside, criminal information indicator, and we just set it to true. And then it's got an ID, JMD01 for Justice Metadata 01. Again, it's just a unique ID within this document. So that JMD01 works just fine. And then here's the charge that it applies to. And the charge points to it. And the charge says, hey, I have metadata that applies to me. That metadata is JMD01. And so we know what metadata, we look for that ID. And we know that this criminal information indicator equaling true means that the stuff in this charge is criminal information. So that's exactly what we wanted. JSON, however, does not have a metadata attribute link. It just has the IDs. So we'll just use the IDs and just link them together like that. And that's the best we can do in JSON LD. It doesn't have as much semantic meaning as the XML version, but that's just too bad. This is what we have. This is what we have to work with. So that's what it looks like. Now we could, if we wanted to, because metadata can have multiple IDs in it. Now we're going to drop into the source here. Drop into the source. And we could, if we wanted to. So here's our XML. We could, if we wanted to, being fancy live on camera, we can copy this. We can make a second one and then add it over here. Whoops. And that would work just fine. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense because I've copied the exact same metadata block, but this could be a different chunk of metadata. This section here could be a different metadata object, could be a NIEM core metadata object with all the generic NIEM core metadata that's in there. But the big part, the important part, is that this metadata attribute can point to more than one attribute. So this object can point to more than one metadata block that applies to it. Now let's undo that and get us back to where we were. There we go. And go back to our pretty view. So that's the instance document. JSON LD doesn't have a metadata attribute. You just link them together and you get the meaning because, hey, this is a metadata block, and that tells us that, hey, this is metadata that applies to that charge. So artifact-wise, let's look at our text file that we've been building. And here we added the metadata at the bottom, just metadata criminal information indicator as a separate object. And here is our mapping spreadsheet. Whoop, didn't load it. Let's give it another chance to do that right. There we go. And here at the very bottom, we've added our metadata. So we've got our is criminal information. We mapped that to criminal information indicator, but it's inside this JMetadata object. Put the types in straight out of NIEM. The metadata is in the indicator is inside the metadata object. We've got our definitions right out of NIEM, and then we've done the pathing over here. Now, to be honest, this is kind of a pain because up until now, I've been saying, hey, if you don't want to do referencing, you don't have to, right? If you're doing an association and you don't want to use the IDs and the refs and have the objects being associated outside the association, that's okay. You can put them inside the association. And when we talked about roles, said, hey, roles point to the object playing the role, but if you want to put the object inside the role, you can do that as well and avoid the referencing. You can't do that with metadata. Metadata right now requires the referencing. It requires having a separate metadata object with an ID, and then the objects to which that metadata applies having the metadata pointer to them. That will probably change in NIEM 6. And in NIEM 6, that metadata block will probably just go inside the charge. It's being worked out. It's one of the things we're working on right now, figuring out exactly how that will work and what are the implications. But this is the one place where, yeah, you're required to do the referencing, and we're trying to eliminate that for NIEM 6. So, we don't want to require people to do that, and it just would be easier and simpler And probably easier to understand to just put the metadata block inside the charge. And it would just be, it'd be charge description text, charge felony indicator, and then the next element would be the metadata block, and inside there would be the criminal information indicator. You're still going to have the metadata block to make the criminal information indicator stand out as being metadata and to allow it to be applied to different things. But it should be simpler in NIEM 6. That's not a promise, but that's what we're working on. That's the idea. So this section should be a little easier in the future.